Hi everyone. Hi to QA Kids. It's been a while since I've done one of these videos. I think it was November 2025, just preparing those Year 12s for their final exams for the November session. I'm on leave, long service leave, and I should be back in early June to come and torture your minds for a bit more longer before I hang up the boots, so to speak, with my teaching career. But today I thought I would focus on looking at the global IA, given that most of you are submitting your final version, I believe, in week 4. So that's only like 3 weeks away. So I thought it would be an opportune time to talk about the global. Look, I don't do short videos. I'm not Econ Plus Dow, so I'm not doing your 4-minute, 5-minute jobs or 15 minutes. This could go for an hour. It'll be pretty intense, and so I'll talk about the things that I look at for when I'm marking these things and what I appreciate and what hits the rubric. Um, Having said that, I will take pauses in between to, have a cup of tea or something. And I'm not working to a script. I'm just going ad-libbing based upon what I see in front of me. When it comes to the global IA, most of you would have selected a topic by now. Most of us probably, when I mean most of us, I mean the teaching team that I belong to at QA, most of us believe that probably the best topic to do it on is trade and trade protectionism in particular, because it allows you to, explain and analyse and evaluate using the standard diagrams that we would use in that particular topic. So when you think about it, I think the best way to maximise your mark for this particular IA and your portfolio overall is to either do the tariff diagram, the quota diagram, the domestic subsidy, or the export subsidy. One of those four. My preference is definitely the tariff, whether it's an introduction or an increase for tariff, or the other way, a reduction in the tariff or the elimination. I honestly believe that is the best way to go. It's straightforward, it's simple, it allows you to explain, analyse, and evaluate quite comfortably based upon the article you select. And, most of you should be getting 12 out of 14, if not 13. The one I'm showing you today is someone who got 13 for it. So it's not perfect, but it's right up there to where it should be. So, like I said, for the portfolio mark, it's worth 20% towards your final grade. The KISS principle: keep it simple, stupid. Don't do anything fancy. No fancy articles. No fancy topics. Just the bread and butter stuff, which is also useful too for your final exam. I know in the past I've mentioned to students that if you look at the IB subject reports that are released by chief examiners, often some of them will say that it's really important for us as a teaching group to inform students that the IA portfolio is the best tool or instrument to actually teach you the skills that are necessary and required for your final exam. So if you do kind of do really well in your IAs, then it's just simply a matter of transferring a lot of those skills to the final exam. I mean, the differences with final exam, of course, you don't know the topics, but if you stick to the skills that you're familiar with in writing your 3 IAs, and I know at QA we do a practice one in year 10, so you essentially do 4. So you should be very familiar with these skills, especially once you get into year 12. Now, I know this particular video is for Year 12s doing the global, but really this is also useful for the Year 11s because the same kind of template or skills you have to display in your Year 11 IA and micro, and when you're starting to do the macro graph. So this is targeted, for Year 11s and 12s. I mean, really it's targeted for Year 10s as well towards the back part of the year. But anyway, they're my musings on that thought. This is the title page. You should have a title page for every IA that you do, and it can just be as simple as the one that's on the screen. In fact, that's the desirable one. You got your title, you got your source, you got the publication date of the article, you got the date the commentary was written. So remember, the IA or the article must be within 12 months of writing it, so it can't be more than a year old, because you could lose the mark on your portfolio criteria. Word count, look, stick to 800. 800 is the word count, so I would religiously stick to it. Look, I suppose they're not going to punish you if it's 801 or 802, but I would certainly go out of my way to keep it under 800. Probably somewhere between that 780, 800 is the ballpark I would be writing for. Don't do 750. You could easily lose the mark by not addressing something that you should be addressing in 20 to 30, 40 words, whatever it is. So get to close to 800 as possible. Do not exceed it. Okay, do not exceed the word limit. Obviously, put your name. I've taken a name off this. You've got to put down the relevant section of the syllabus, global economics in this case, and then the key concept there, which is interdependence. So remember, the key concept you use in every IA as part of your portfolio has to be completely different. It can't be the same one used twice. Interdependence over the years, I think, has become probably the best one to use. That's the nature of trade. Nations are interdependent. They depend upon each other for resources, for goods and services, for import and export business. So I think it's the most relevant one. Now, when you do these things, I always go to the subject guide and go to the early part of it, look at the 9 key concepts, look at interdependence, and then look at the aspects or the elements of what interdependence is. And you must ensure that these are visible in your article so you can actually talk about them. So that's what I look at in order to give the 3 marks out of 3 for the key concept criteria. I really look to see if you have unpacked the aspects of the key concept throughout your essay. We'll have a look through this essay to see if it's done it. Next bit is the article. So hopefully you've selected a decent article. Ideally 2 to 3 pages. When you cut and paste it from the online site to Word. It's not a requirement for you to highlight the parts that you were talking about if it's less than 2 pages. It is a requirement if your IA article is beyond 2 pages, but as a good habit, I would encourage you, irrespective of the length of the IA, you should highlight the key aspects that you are explicitly or implicitly talking about. Don't just highlight a phrase or a word. Actually highlight a full paragraph or a sentence or two that you're talking about. Do not just highlight a phrase or two. It's a big no-no. It does annoy the external examiners, and we're not here to annoy them. We want to make their life simple. Like I said, keep to about, I think, 2.5 max. I really wouldn't do any one of these long, extensive ones. And at the same time, I wouldn't do a short one. The problem with doing a short one, of course, is that it's not going to give you the analytical and evaluative points that you need to talk about throughout your essay. So I think, 2.5 pages is the Goldilocks amount. But as a given, please highlight the sentences or paragraphs that you use, and you can see that this candidate has done it pretty well as we scroll through. Yep. Okay, so pretty decent. For me, my thing is I like to see the title, the date, and probably the website in this early bit here. I really like to see that. so I can check, I can verify that the article meets the criteria for criterion F. Let's go to the start of the essay. Okay, now this particular student has put the page numbers down the bottom. I would do that. My preference is that the page number is in the middle at the top, because often as an examiner you want to give feedback, and so it's much easier to do the feedback if you say, page 4, paragraph 2, and then you make your feedback. So please put in page numbers, preferably at the top in the center. I know from recent feedback that I've seen from external examiners, because they're getting a whole portfolio, the micro, macro, and global, sometimes it's hard to distinguish where the article finishes and the commentary start. So my recommendation is now, as this student's done here, just put commentary at the top left-hand corner, put it in bold so it stands out. Okay. One thing I typically like to see, I'm just going to skip to the second page of the commentary, is the diagram, and that's a pretty good diagram. Ideally, I like to see that diagram on the first page, but given the size of this particular diagram, in terms of, I guess, formatting, it was difficult to put it on the first page. But ideally, I like to see the introduction, maybe a short paragraph on any assumptions you make, then the diagram, and then first brief analytical paragraph around your diagram. Thinking around using a tariff diagram has changed. Once upon a time, we used to get kids to draw 2 diagrams. Pretty much exactly the same diagram. The first diagram would talk about the basic analysis of an introduction or elimination of a tariff. The second diagram usually was very, it was low-level evaluation, because you talk about changes in consumer welfare by looking at the triangles and rectangles that have changed. I'll get into that shortly. But my preference is there should be a diagram on the first page, but if you can't squeeze it in, no big deal. But having said that, thinking now is that we have one big, neat, nice diagram where it allows you to do the analysis and the low-level evaluation in separate paragraphs, and you'll see what I mean shortly. Okay, so let's go back to the introduction. Okay. Introduction should be, I think, 8 to 10 lines, probably closer to 10 lines. Its purpose is that you really need to summarise the article for the examiner, but from an economics perspective. So not a description about what the article is about, but what the article is about in economic terms. Okay, so if we look through this particular opening paragraph, you can see it's about how a tariff in the Philippines on rice has been reduced from 35 to 15% in order to improve food security. The third line there is addressing the terminology criteria. It's giving a definition without giving a definition. It's just letting know the examiner that you're au fait on top of the terminology. Then early on, you need to say something about interdependence, right? It's really important that you do talk about the key concept, and in a way, you should be trying to justify it. So when you think about this particular article, the level of interdependence between the Philippines and Vietnam is going to increase, because lowering the tariff allows Filipinos to import more rice from Vietnam, which generally is a good thing, but it does have some negative aspects to it, which the student actually talks about based on the article. But I think it's really important to, I guess, mention to the examiner that you're justifying why interdependence is an appropriate key concept to talk about in this particular essay. Okay, so you can see that the student is already signposting to the examiner. He's going to do a little bit of evaluation. However, greater interdependence harms Filipino rice farmers, leads to unintended consequences of reduced self-sufficiency, which exposes the country to global shock. So he's really summarising already in the introduction what he is going to talk about, and then makes it clear that the conceptual lens is interdependence, which will be used to analyse and evaluate the tariff cut and its effect on key stakeholders. Remember, the minute you talk about the key concept throughout your essay, you're going to say something about it, put the key concept in bold. You must do that, and you must also mention the key concept in the opening paragraph. It really should be almost, you see the key concept in bold at least once in every paragraph throughout the entire essay. Okay, I'm just going to pause for a tick. Okay, crew, I'm just back again, just talking about this first page of the commentary. In particular, I'm now looking at the second little mini paragraph following the introduction. If you have any kind of general assumptions you want to make about a model that you're using or something which is relevant in your IA, then this is the place to do it. So if you think back to your micro, a lot of you looked at the introduction of attacks to correct an externality. At that point, you may have said some kind of assumption about the elasticity of demand of the product. In this case, we're talking about the Philippines importing and being a significant importer of rice. In fact, they're the world largest. So it's really important to say in this instance that the Philippines would obviously have a comparative disadvantage because they're importing. I mean, if you're looking at a situation where you're a net exporter, or the country you're looking at is a net exporter, then you would say you have a comparative advantage. I think it's nice to do that because, again, it gets back to the terminology. You're bringing in an assumption, and even later on in the second half of the essay, when you get to the evaluation page on the final page, you can actually pull apart the assumption and say, well, if this assumption didn't hold, then the circumstances might be different and things would look this way. He's actually justified it, which I think is really important too. So if you are using a simplifying assumption, then you need to justify why you're doing that. And so he's done that here because it's the world's largest importer. But then this second sentence is really crucial. Given that Vietnam currently supplies 80% of Filipino rice market, it is assumed that Vietnam can supply the entire Filipino market at the world price. All that simply means is if I just jump ahead back to the diagram, the world supply curve is perfectly elastic because it's just basically telling the examiner, look, it's like a pretty competitive market, the world market. In this instance, we're saying that Vietnam has the capacity to supply the entire Filipino market at the world price. Now, that may not be true, but it's a simplifying assumption which enables you to put in that perfectly elastic world supply curve. Just while I'm at the diagram, sometimes I know in the past, sometimes students put 3 of these lines in if it's a tariff reduction, because what they put in also is the world supply curve where there is no tariff. I would not do that because it makes it very confusing. All you need to do is to talk about the change that's actually occurring in the article. So in this case, the change was from 35% to 15%. There is absolutely no need whatsoever to talk about the situation of free trade, no trade, whatever. I know that's how we start teaching it to you, but the article, the IA, is about the reduction in the tariff from 35 to 15%. That's all you need to do. he's also put the percentages in, which will help you consolidate your mark for application, because it's applying the numbers that are in your essay, in your article, into the essay or into the diagram. So it's a good thing to do, if you have the numbers. If you don't have the numbers for the tariff, you can have, higher or lower tariff, whatever it is, just to show you're doing some kind of application. One thing I will tell you, just quickly looking at the diagram while we're here, don't forget to put a title. Full labelling for the axes, so the price of rice in Filipino peso, so the price of whatever the product is in the currency or the exchange rate that's in the article. The horizontal axis, the quantity of whatever the product is, and the unit of measurement. Often you guys don't put in the unit measurement. Look, they could ping you for a marked error on criteria A, so that's why we encourage you to put the quantity of whatever it is, the item, and then the unit of measurement that is typically associated with that product. A tip for when you do the welfare analysis, when you start doing consumer producer surplus, government revenue, dead weight loss, etc., label it the way he's done it. Okay, so we go from top to bottom and left to right. So you can see A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. Okay, so don't make it like alphabet soup. It makes it really difficult to follow. Make it sequential from top to bottom, from left to right. Okay, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. Do you need to have all those letters there? I would only label the areas that you are going to specifically talk about. And, we'll come back to that as we talk through the essay. And then, more importantly, your quantities, okay, are consistent. And then I like to see imports before and after the tariff, but show that beneath the axes, okay, not here. You want to keep the center of the diagram really clear, all right? You don't want it messy, and you can see that, it's so clear there. All the labeling is outside the center of a diagram. Keep that center of a diagram nice and neat and clean. Okay, so let's go back to that assumption paragraph. Look, it's up to you whether you want to do it. I like it. Maybe that's a proclivity I have. Being a former academic, that we typically, when you write research papers, you put any assumptions up front so the readers know where you're coming from. But I wouldn't spend too much time. Like, literally 2 sentences is sufficient, and they've got to be meaningful. Okay, now at that point, that's where I would like to see the diagram. Okay, straight after the assumption paragraph. And then this paragraph here is one that would be underneath the diagram. Now, given that this candidate's diagram was so large, he could not fit it onto the front page. No big deal. That's just a thing I have. So, figure 1, paragraph there, that's where you do your basic analysis. Okay, you don't really do any evaluation there. You're just explaining the basics of ceteris paribus, something has changed and what's been in effect. So in this case, we had a 35% tariff. We've relaxed that assumption. We now have a 15% tariff, and then we work through analytically the changes, right? So the first thing that will happen is the tariff brings down the world supply curve. Okay, so he goes on to say that the quantity was this amount. Okay, so he's assessing beforehand. So when it was at 35%, local farmers produced Q1, local consumers demand Q2. The difference or residuals made up by imports mainly from Vietnam. When the tariff reduced at the lower price, local farmers are only able to supply Q3, as they are unable to compete with the imported cheaper rice, while consumers increase the quantity demanded to Q4. As a result, the quantity of imports increases from Q2 to Q1, Q4 to Q3. So again, analytical, it's just a basic analysis. Price comes down, local consumption goes up, local production goes down, leading to an increase in imports. And in this case, he finishes off that paragraph, that analytical paragraph, with a link back to the key concept, which is beautiful, right? Because if you up the amount of imports, clearly you are increasing the degree of interdependence between those two countries. So I really love it when I see that. He's also made the point here that the tariff will lower prices for consumers and also reduce farmers' incomes by that amount. So he's doing a little bit of basic welfare analysis there. So that's why he's put in CDGHI. So if we go down there, looking at farmers' incomes, okay, so before they got CDIHG, but after the removal of tariff, the local farmers only get to keep G and H. Okay, so it's just doing some basic welfare analysis there, which is some evaluation. What also is good about this paragraph is don't forget to use quotes, and they just need to be just small phrases, which just give you the evidence to back up the points that you are making. So no examiner wants to see heaps of quotes. One or two basic quotes in a paragraph are great because it just provides evidence to show that you're synthesizing, you're pulling it all together from the article and your own thinking and your understanding of theory. Don't put a lot of quotes in. Don't put full sentence quotes in. It's just examiners hate that. They will mark you down so severely if you do that. So just, one or two quotes per paragraph and literally, just a couple of words just to support your argument, right? Don't make it your argument, just evidence to support your argument. Okay, I'll have another pause there. Okay, back again. So if we, what I talked about before the pause break there was the first paragraph which supports the diagram, which is the basic analysis. Something shifts, prices change, quantities change in response. I think with the tariff IA, there should be a second paragraph which does the low-level evaluation. So this is just your standard BOG welfare analysis. So this is where it starts for this candidate here. So you can see consumer surplus goes from AB to A, B, C, D, E, F, brought about by lower prices and greater quantity consumed. That's magic. That shows a depth of understanding of the terminology. It just doesn't say consumer surplus goes from this to this. It goes from this to this because it increases because there's lower people pay lower prices and they're consuming more. So that's why consumer surplus increases. At the same, he also says Filipino rice farmers suffer as producer surplus decreases from CG to G as producers struggle to compete. Okay, so, obviously they're getting lower prices. Okay, so what he's basically saying is with the cut in tariffs, if we look at this diagram, consumer surplus goes from AB to A, B, C, D, E, F, so it's expanded by this trapezium. However, local producers used to have producer surplus of C and G. They've lost area C and it's now just down to G. Okay, so good. So it should always be that order. You talk about the effect on consumers, then you talk about the effect on local producers, then you talk about any impact on government, and then the loss of efficiency, whether dead weight loss increases or decreases, and then as a fifth item, you could talk about any impact on overseas producers. You should follow that order. Consumers, producers, government, overall efficiency, and then any impact on foreigners. Okay, so if we continue with the second paragraph supporting the diagram, which is the low-level evaluation, he talks about government revenue will decrease because obviously you are cutting the tax or the tariff. And then there's a little bit of valuation here because he says, look, that's going to compromise the ability of the government being able to provide support programs to soften the blow for farmers. Okay, so he's thinking the good and the bad, which is good to see. And then there's the pointing towards the allocated efficiency. So in this case, you're not, generally speaking, when you reduce protectionism in the short term, you kind of improve overall efficiency. And so in this case, it's indicated by the diagrams DNF. The triangles DNF. So your little dead weight loss triangles, they now, go towards the increase in consumer surplus. So it's a good thing there. Okay, and also he adds to it more evidence from the article. So the little quote there, stiff competition. So it's saying that, that allows resources to be reallocated into other areas apart from rice farming, which may be used more efficiently and to diversify crops. Then he talks about the benefits to the Vietnamese growers. So the foreign growers will benefit as export revenues increase. From area J to IJK. Okay, so there's a little bit of an increase there, highlighting the growing independence between the two nations. So again, the Vietnamese growers are making more money out of the Filipino market, and that improves the level of interdependence. And then you can see there that then finishes off there with more, discussion of the key concept. Filipino consumers become more dependent on Vietnam for cheap, steady rice, which may undermine their food security. Okay, so again, tipping the hat to the key concept and having a bit of an understanding that sometimes with greater interdependence, there are some unintended consequences. Okay. Towards the bottom of page 6 or bottom of page 2 now, starting page 3, is where the more medium to higher level of evaluation is going to occur. So typically I like to see the evaluation occurring on the final page. The first page or two is just explaining and analysing what's changed, and that's pretty reminiscent of what you do in paper 1, part B. The first half of the essay you'd be showing how the theory should work, and then in the second part of your paper 1, part B, you start to pull it apart and say, well, these are the howevers, or it depends. So you start to do the higher level evaluation. Okay, so here it starts off in the short term. Oh, good, beautiful. Short term, long term, there are always different consequences. So that's highlighting that class aspect about the time dimension, which might have an impact. Okay, so in the short term, the biggest winners are the consumers, naturally, and in particular low-income households. It's always nice to pick a particular group of people. And then kind of explains why they do benefit, so greater purchasing power. It also lowers the rate of inflation, so that means purchasing power for people may improve. However, this may come with a potential trade-off as the Philippines grows more dependent on Vietnamese rice, economic independence deepens. While this may strengthen trading relationship, it also makes the Philippines more exposed to supply shock or any political differences between nations. Okay, so he's picking up what's in the article, where the article actually says, look, the danger is that you become so dependent on the Vietnamese. What happens if Vietnam is unable to supply you with that rice? If you have a political difference or something economically catastrophic happens and the Vietnamese decide not to export, then that makes the Philippines very vulnerable. Now, what we have taught you when you do that final page of evaluation, or you're doing paper 1, part B, is that double teal structure. within a paragraph, meaning that you claim and counterclaim. Okay, so that double teal TOC structure, it's like a TOC essay. You want to see the claim developed and explained with evidence, okay, and then immediately followed by the counterclaim. So if you think about it, you can see the first part of this paragraph is very positive. It's showing how it benefits the local consumers. And then the second half of the paragraph is a counterclaim. However, the problem is you may deepen into dependence too much, and then that puts the Philippines at risk or vulnerable. So we really like to see that. So the claim is developed in a teal structure, so topic sentence, example evidence, application analysis, link back to your question. And then the second part of the paragraph is the counterclaim, okay? So maybe a negative. And ideally, if you can make the negative a consequence of the positive, even better. But that's the top structure there, okay? So then he's got his next big evaluation paragraph. Okay, despite these gains, domestic farmers are likely to suffer the most. So now he's talking about how the local producers are, going to suffer, and but then he also claims too, based on the article, that the government is trying to support those rice farmers by giving subsidies. Okay, so they understand there's a period of adjustment for the local producers and will compensate. But then again, there's a counterclaim. However, commentators have argued that this support may lead to lower sales, nudging Vietnam growers to seek alternative overseas marketing, threatening rice supply into the Philippines. So again, the counterclaim is based on evidence that is visible in the article. So good to see, a claim counteracted by a counterclaim, which is excellent to see. Okay, I guess thinking ever since we've gone from the old syllabus to the new syllabus, where the key concept criteria was introduced worth 3 marks, and the word limit has gone from 750 to 800 words. 50 words isn't sufficient to do an additional amount of explanation around the key concept. So once upon a time, on the old syllabus, we would have advised kids to probably do 3 decent paragraphs on evaluation, double teal paragraphs. But our thinking now has kind of changed. That if you do 2 decent top structured paragraphs there, the claim and counterclaim, I think that should be sufficient. And you can see that the length of those paragraphs are pretty good. So that first one, maybe a little bit short, 10, 11, 12 lines. And then the next one is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about close to 14. I think those valuation paragraphs should be about 10 to 14 lines. So again, make the claim, develop the claim, and then develop the counterclaim below it. Okay, it's nice to see, on this hand, on the other hand, have that kind of argument with yourself in the essay. Back and forth is good to see. And then finally, we come to the conclusion of the essay, and the conclusion at the end should back up what you talked about in the introduction. It shouldn't just be summarising what you talked about. Remember, I've always kind of said that when you're doing evaluation and you're looking at a conclusion, whether it's in the IA or a paper 1 part B or paper 2 part G, it should be substantiated, meaning you need to select the argument that you've made in the previous evaluation paragraphs, the reason why you think this policy change is good, bad, or indifferent. Okay, because really that's what you're doing. You're looking at the effect of, in this case, of lowering the tariff. You're looking at the effect on different groups of people, and then you need to make some kind of judgment on whether that change is good, bad, ugly, or indifferent. Okay, it doesn't matter what you say, so long as your judgment is backed up by the evidence that you presented in your valuation paragraphs and your analysis. So if you have a quick read through of that paragraph, you know, again, the key concept, it is essential that the key concept is mentioned and a big sweeping general statement is made about the key concept in the final paragraph. So he says, yep, the level of trade has increased, therefore the level of interdependence between the two nations has increased. While the growth is enhancing interdependence, benefiting the local consumers and lowering inflation, it does come with negatives. The lower tariff will hurt local rice farmers, while an unintended consequence of a greater degree of interconnectedness is a reduction in self-sufficiency, making the Philippines more vulnerable to external shocks. So kind of sitting on the fence there, which is fine, but has highlighted, the strengths of doing this, the benefits, a particular group of people who are going to benefit, but at the same time acknowledges that, greater interdependence is not always, roses. Sometimes, there are thorns associated with it. Sometimes there are not so good things. Okay. And you can see down the bottom, always important to put the word count there, 798. So just to remind the examiner. But look, as an examiner, when you mark thousands of these, it's about 3 pages. If a student writes more than 3 pages, they've basically exceeded the word limit. Just in terms of presentation, these are things that I just like. I like the slides justified, so you can see there in the Word document, if you go to this tab here, that justifies, so, it's even on both sides. Line spacing should be 1.5. Font size should be 12. Stick to a particular style, so in this case it's Arial. So Calibri, Arial, or Times Roman is fine. They're the 3 that you should use, but only use one of them. Be consistent. Make sure when you pod, so when you're talking about points on the diagram, put them in bold, so when the examiner looks at it, they can quickly check with the diagram to see that they're correct and consistent. Basically, don't forget when you put any quotes in, and remember I said just paraphrase some short phrases from the article as a supporting evidence for your points, your arguments. Just put in italics and inverted commas so it sticks out. The examiner can see that you're, applying stuff and synthesizing. Don't forget to put, whenever you talk about the key concept, you're going to explain something, put the key concept in bold so the examiner sees it all the way through. Okay, so like I said, I think this did get about 13. It may have gotten 12, but 12, 13, which is where you need to be. If you're going to kind of get 12 or 13 on each one of your IAs, and then you pick up your 3 marks for the portfolio criteria, you're travelling on 17, 18 out of 20 walking into that test, which means you were sitting on a 2 before you even start the exam. So really try to maximise your result on your portfolio. Okay, I will post this up onto YouTube so you can watch. I'll see if I can put it up in Depot, but I think in the short term, because I'm not at work, I'll have to put it up on YouTube, and I'll put the link up there. Give me some feedback. Tell me if it's useful or not so useful. Really love to hear from you. And wish you all the best getting this done. You've only got a couple of weeks to get it done. I'm not taking any emails at the moment because I'm technically on leave, but I'm sure your other teachers will support you, and pretty much my thinking is pretty aligned with the way they think about the IAs. Okay, guys, see you later. I hope to do more videos in the future about topics and getting you ready for exams in November. But, this is the first attempt in the new year, given that I did a few towards the end of last year. All the best. See you guys later. Thanks.